In January of 1923, a town called Rosewood sat along a narrow stretch of road in Levy County, Florida. It had a general store, 3 churches, a sugar mill, a turpentine operation, a baseball diamond, and roughly 200 residents, most of them black, most of them property owners. Census records from 1920 confirm the names, the addresses, the occupations. By January 7th, 1923, the town was gone. Not abandoned, not flooded, not condemned. Burned, every structure, every home, every church, the general store, the sugar mill, the school. Burned to the ground over the course of 6 days by a mob that grew from a few dozen to several hundred. The state of Florida did not send the National Guard until the killing was nearly over, and then, for the next 60 years, the name Rosewood vanished from public memory so completely that when survivors finally testified before the Florida legislature in 1994, several lawmakers admitted they had never heard of it. Not the massacre. The town. They had never heard of the town. The 1920 United States Census recorded 144 black residents in Rosewood and roughly 200 in the surrounding community. The census listed them by name: Sylvester Carrier, Sarah Carrier, Lexi Gordon, James Carrier, Sam Carter. These were not transient labourers. These were families who held property deeds. They owned their homes. Several owned acreage. 2 families ran small businesses. The turpentine industry in Levy County depended on black labour, and Rosewood was one of the communities where that labour lived in relative stability, with generational land ownership stretching back to Reconstruction. Property records in the Levy County Courthouse, the ones that survived, confirm this. Black families in Rosewood held deeds. This was not sharecropping country. This was ownership. And that distinction matters, because what was destroyed in January of 1923 was not just lives, it was an economic foothold. Homes with equity, land with value, structures that represented 30 years of accumulated wealth in a community that the surrounding white population had every economic incentive to displace. The catalyst for the massacre was a claim made on January 1, 1923, by a white woman named Fannie Taylor in the nearby town of Sumner. She said a black man had assaulted her. No suspect was named. No evidence was presented. Local authorities immediately organised a search party. Within hours, that search party became a lynch mob. They found a black man named Sam Carter on a road near Rosewood. They tortured him. They hanged him. They mutilated his body. And they did not stop there. What happened next unfolded across 6 days, and the timeline reveals something that official histories have rarely examined closely: the acceleration. The shift from a lynch mob seeking one alleged suspect to a coordinated destruction of an entire community did not happen spontaneously. It followed a pattern, and that pattern has a geography. On January 1st, the mob killed Sam Carter. On January 4th, a group of armed white men attacked the home of Sylvester and Sarah Carrier, where women and children had gathered for protection. Sylvester Carrier was killed. Sarah Carrier was killed. At least 2 of the attackers were also killed and others wounded, which enraged the mob further. On January 5th and 6th, organised groups began moving through Rosewood methodically, burning homes one by one. Witnesses described the burnings as systematic, not chaotic, not the result of random violence, but sequential, structure by structure, beginning at the edges of town and moving inward. By January 7th, there was nothing left standing. Local train conductors, both black and white, smuggled women and children out of the area in freight cars and under tarps. A white shopkeeper named John Wright sheltered some families in his home. But the town itself was erased. Every building, every fence line. The road remained, the land remained, the people were gone. Now consider the geography. Rosewood sat between Cedar Key and Sumner, both majority white towns. Cedar Key had been a prosperous port in the 19th century and was in decline by the 1920s. Sumner was a company town anchored by the Cummer & Sons Cypress Company, a major lumber operation. Rosewood's black residents occupied land that was increasingly valuable to the timber industry, situated along the rail line that Cummer & Sons depended on. This is not speculation. This is cartography. The land that Rosewood families owned was strategically positioned. After the massacre, that land was either abandoned, seized for back taxes, or sold under duress. Within a decade, most of it was absorbed into timber holdings. No legal process adjudicated this transfer. No court intervened. The families who fled never returned. And no one in an official capacity ever told them they could. In the immediate aftermath, Levy County officials filed no charges. The state attorney convened a grand jury in February of 1923. That grand jury heard testimony from white residents of Sumner and law enforcement. It did not call a single black survivor. It returned no indictments. The foreman's statement read, in part, that insufficient evidence existed to identify the perpetrators. In a town of 2,000 white residents, where the mob had operated in broad daylight for 6 days, no one could be identified. Not one. The grand jury's records were sealed. They remained sealed for decades. And the silence began. The second pattern is more disturbing than the first, because it requires asking a question about systems rather than individuals. Who burned Rosewood is at this point historically established. The mob's composition has been reconstructed through survivor testimony, journalistic investigation, and the research of historians like Maxine Jones at Florida State University, whose 1993 report for the Florida Board of Regents remains the most comprehensive academic account. Local men from Sumner. Men from surrounding towns in Levy and Citrus counties, men who traveled from as far as Gainesville and Jacksonville when word spread. Some brought their families to watch. This is documented. The harder question is not who, but what happened to the evidence afterward. Because the erasure of Rosewood was not a single event. It was a process that continued for 70 years. Start with the newspapers. The massacre was covered in real time by several Florida papers and by black newspapers nationally. The Chicago Defender ran front-page stories. The New York Times published a brief report. The Jacksonville Times-Union covered it. These articles exist. They are archived. They name the dead. They describe the burnings. And yet by the 1930s, Rosewood had disappeared from Florida history curricula, from Levy County records, and from public discourse. The 1920 census is the last federal document to record Rosewood as a populated community. By the 1930 census, the town was simply absent. Not listed as destroyed, not listed as relocated. Absent, as if 200 people and their homes had never existed. The Levy County tax rolls tell a parallel story. After 1923, several Rosewood properties appear with new owners, white owners, and no recorded sale, no transfer deed, no foreclosure filing, just a name change in the ledger. Minnie Lee Langley, a survivor who was a child during the massacre, later testified that her family's land was taken without compensation, without legal process, and without any communication from county authorities. She did not learn what had happened to the deed until the 1990s. She was in her 80s by then. The Florida State Archives compounded this absence. For decades, the state maintained no official file on the Rosewood Massacre. When Arnett Doctor, a descendant of survivors, began researching his family's history in the 1980s, he found that state agencies had no records, no correspondence, and no documentation of any kind relating to the events of January 1923, a massacre that destroyed an entire town, killed an unknown number of people. Estimates range from 8 to over 100, depending on the source, and generated contemporary newspaper coverage simply did not exist in the state's institutional memory. The question this raises is not conspiratorial, it is procedural. How does a documented event involving hundreds of perpetrators, multiple fatalities, the complete destruction of a community, and contemporary press coverage become invisible within a single generation? The answer is not dramatic, it is bureaucratic. And that makes it worse. Place the two patterns side by side. The first is physical destruction, the burning of a town, the killing of its residents, the forced displacement of its survivors. The second is institutional erasure, the failure to prosecute, the disappearance of records, the absorption of land, the absence of the event from educational and governmental archives. These two patterns are not separate. They are sequential, and their sequence reveals something about the infrastructure of forgetting. The mob did not need to destroy the records. The institutions did that on their own. The grand jury heard no black testimony and returned no indictments. The county tax office recorded property transfers with no legal basis. The state filed no report. The federal census simply stopped counting. Each institution, acting within its own bureaucratic logic, contributed to the same outcome, the complete disappearance of a community from the documentary record. And this is where the human cost becomes most specific. The survivors of Rosewood did not just lose their homes, they lost their proof. Property deeds that would have entitled them to compensation were destroyed or altered. Birth records that would have established residency were gone. The census that recorded their names was the last official document to acknowledge they had been there at all. When Arnett Doctor began tracking down survivors in the 1980s, he found elderly men and women scattered across Florida and the Gulf Coast, in Gainesville, in Lakuchi, in Jacksonville, who had carried the memory of Rosewood for 60 years, in almost total silence. Not because they had forgotten. Because they had been told, explicitly and implicitly, that speaking about it was dangerous. Minnie Lee Langley said her mother told her never to mention Rosewood, never to tell anyone where they came from. The silence was not passive, it was enforced. By fear, by the knowledge that the men who burned the town were still alive, still in power, still in Levy County. By the understanding that the legal system that had failed them in 1923 was the same legal system they would have to petition for justice. And that system had already demonstrated what it thought their testimony was worth. The mechanisms of suppression in the Rosewood case are not hidden, they are documented, and they are mundane. That is what makes them significant. There was no executive order to erase Rosewood. There was no secret committee. There was a grand jury that declined to indict. A county clerk who recorded property transfers without deeds. A state archive that filed nothing. A school system that taught nothing. A generation of survivors who were silenced by the reasonable and well-founded fear that speaking would bring retaliation. Each of these is a small act. Each is individually explicable. Taken together, they constitute a system of erasure so thorough that by the 1970s you could grow up in Levy County, Florida, drive past the site where Rosewood once stood, and have no idea you were passing through the ruins of a massacre. The road was still there. The land was still there. The trees had grown back, but the town, the people, the history, all of it had been absorbed into the landscape as if it had never been disturbed. Academic history did not engage with Rosewood until 1982, when journalist Gary Moore began investigating the story for the St. Petersburg Times. Moore spent over a decade tracking survivors, cross-referencing property records, and piecing together the timeline. His work led directly to the Florida legislature, commissioning the 1993 report by a team of historians led by Maxine Jones. That report, titled A Documented History of the Incident which occurred at Rosewood, Florida in January 1923, confirmed the massacre, the destruction of the town, the failure of the legal system, and the systematic erasure of the event from public records. It also confirmed what the survivors had said all along, that the death toll was almost certainly higher than the 8 fatalities acknowledged in contemporary reports. Bodies were buried in mass graves. Others were thrown into the Gulf. The exact number will never be known. The report led to the passage of the Rosewood Compensation Act in 1994, which made Florida the first state in American history to compensate survivors of a racial massacre. 9 survivors received $150,000 each. A scholarship fund was established for their descendants. It was, in many ways, a landmark, but it came 71 years after the event. Most of the survivors were dead. Most of the property was unrecoverable, and the compensation, while symbolically significant, could not restore what had been taken, not just the homes, not just the land, but the generational wealth, the community networks, the institutional memory, the simple fact of having existed in a place and having that existence acknowledged. Today, if you drive along State Road 24 in Levy County, Florida, you will pass the site where Rosewood once stood. There is a historical marker. It was erected in 2004, 81 years after the massacre. The land is wooded now. Pine and cypress have reclaimed the lots where homes stood. The sugar mill foundation is still partially visible beneath the undergrowth if you know where to look. The railroad grade is still traceable, and in the Levy County Courthouse, if you request the right files, you can still find property records that show the transfer of black-owned land to white owners in the years immediately following January 1923 transfers with no recorded consideration, no signatures from the original owners, no legal process of any kind. The survivors' testimony, collected in the 1990s and archived at the University of Florida, remains the most detailed account of what happened. Lee Ruth Davis, who was 9 years old during the massacre, described hiding in the swamps for days, hearing gunfire, watching smoke rise from where her home had been. Roby Morton, who was a child when her family fled on a train, described the sound of the town burning, a continuous roaring, she said, like a storm that did not move. These recordings exist. They are catalogued. They are accessible. The 1920 census pages listing Rosewood's residents are available through the National Archives. The Chicago Defender articles from January and February 1923 are digitized. The 1993 legislative report is a public document. The evidence is not hidden. It was simply unasked for. For 70 years, the paper trail was there, sitting in archives, courthouses, and library collections, waiting for someone to look. The land itself is the most stubborn witness. Ideally, archaeology would be conducted at the Rosewood site, systematic, professional, peer-reviewed. The foundations are there. The refuse pits are there. The material culture of a community that built itself from Reconstruction forward is, in all likelihood, still in the ground, beneath the pine needles and the palmetto scrub. As of now, no comprehensive archaeological survey has been completed. Rosewood was not the only black community destroyed by coordinated white violence in the early 20th century. Tulsa's Greenwood District, 1921, Ocoee, Florida, 1920, Elaine, Arkansas, 1919, Wilmington, North Carolina, 1898. The pattern is documented. The geography is mapped. The timelines are established. What distinguishes Rosewood is the completeness of the erasure, the totality with which a community was physically destroyed and then bureaucratically unmade, so that the destruction itself became invisible. A massacre happened. A town was burned. Families fled. Land was taken. Records were lost or altered. A grand jury found nothing. A state forgot, and for 70 years, the only people who remembered were the people who had been told never to speak of it. Consider what it means to carry a history like that in silence. To know what happened to your family, to your home, to your community, and to live in a society that has no record of it, that has no memory of it, that does not believe you, not because it has examined the evidence and disagreed, but because it has never looked. The census pages are still there, in the National Archives, with the names written in a clerk's careful hand. The town they recorded is not.